April 17th, 1953. A nameless hill, Korea. In the suffocating quiet of the pre-dawn hours, a young American sentinel shivers at his post. He is not a hero from a recruitment poster, but a recent replacement, a teenager plucked from a quiet life and thrust into a frozen, stagnant war. The front has been locked in a brutal stalemate for months, where insignificant hilltops are traded for hundreds of lives to gain mere yards of diplomatic leverage. Exhausted after days in the line, his only companion is the biting cold and the gnawing fear that his rifle, caked in the ubiquitous Korean mud, might fail him. Against every stern warning from his sergeant, he makes a decision born of fatigue and primal fear. In the absolute darkness, he begins to field strip his M1 Garand. His frozen fingers fumble with the bolt, his ears straining for any sound beyond his own breathing. He pulls the trigger assembly. A metallic click echoes, unnaturally loud. He peers down the chamber, convinced it's empty. His finger rests on the trigger as he steadies the barrel. The rifle fires. A single catastrophic crack shatters the silence, a gross violation of every safety protocol, a mistake that will ripple through history. For one heartbeat, the world stops. Then it erupts. The hillside below him ignites with muzzle flashes. A storm of tracer fire arcs toward his position. Eerie, piercing whistles, the sound of Chinese signals cut through the air, followed by the thunderous roar of hundreds of voices charging. His accidental shot, a blunder that should have earned him a court-martial, has been misinterpreted. Down the slope, a Chinese battalion commander, poised to launch a perfectly synchronized attack at 0400, hears the gunshot. Believing his own forward scouts have been discovered or that it is his signal to attack, he makes a split-second decision. He orders the assault now, 13 minutes early. The result is chaos. The enemy soldiers attack with ferocious courage, but their meticulously planned artillery barrage is silent. Their engineers, meant to blow paths through the wire, are still in their trenches. The American defenders, jolted awake by the unexpected but providential early warning, are given those precious unplanned minutes to scramble to their guns. The young private's terrible mistake has just handed his company their only chance to survive. The hill the young private was defending was known to American maps as Hill 255, but to the men who fought and died there, it was Pork Chop Hill. Its nickname, derived from its vague shape on a map, belied its nightmarish reality. By the spring of 1953, the Korean War was not a war of sweeping maneuvers, but a brutal, static negotiation. The real battle was happening in wooden huts at Panmunjom, where armistice talks crawled forward. On the front line, hills like Pork Chop were no longer strategic objectives in a classic sense. They were psychological and political tokens. Capturing one meant proving resolve, gaining a minor advantage for the next bargaining session, or simply making the enemy bleed. For the Chinese, Pork Chop Hill was a dagger aimed at the main American line. Its summit offered a direct line of sight to rear area supply routes and artillery parks. Holding it was a constant drain. Losing it would be a catastrophic blow to the entire sector's stability. For weeks, intelligence reports had painted an ominous picture. Enemy trenches inching closer, nighttime movement, the buildup of attack supplies. Every soldier on the hill knew a storm was coming. They were the sacrifice placed on the altar of diplomacy, ordered to hold a piece of worthless terrain at any cost. The defenders were in no shape for the coming storm. The company holding the line was under strength, a mix of exhausted veterans and terrified replacements, like the private who had fired the shot. They existed in a world of frozen mud, rotting sandbags, and constant tension. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by catnaps between mortar barrages. Their weapons were perpetually filthy, their uniforms never dry. Their commander, Captain James Morrison, knew his position was perilous. His repeated requests for reinforcements or relief were denied. The entire front was stretched thin. His entire defensive plan hinged on one fragile element: early warning. Listening posts were pushed far down the slope, connected by thin wires to the command post. The doctrine was simple. At the first sign of a mass attack, those forward observers would call it in, then fall back, unleashing a pre-planned hellstorm of artillery on the assaulting waves before they reached the main trenches. It was a good plan, but it depended on everything going right. It couldn't account for a single random mistake happening 13 minutes before the enemy's meticulously synchronized clock was set to start. While the American defenders clung to their freezing trench lines, their enemy was executing a plan of chilling precision. Chinese commanders of the 141st Regiment had studied Pork Chop Hill for weeks. Their attack, scheduled for 0400 hours on April 17th, was not a reckless human wave, but a sophisticated combined arms assault. The plan was a clockwork mechanism. First, a concentrated mortar barrage would hammer the American bunkers and machine gun nests. Under this cover, sapper teams would crawl forward to place Bangalore torpedoes, explosive tubes on the barbed wire, blowing clean passages. Only then would the first assault companies rush through the gaps, supported by flamethrower teams to clear fortified positions. Reserve companies stood by to exploit the breakthrough. They had calculated the American artillery response time down to the minute and believed they could overrun the summit before the full weight of U.S. firepower could be brought to bear. Every soldier knew his role. Every unit was synchronized to the second. It was a plan born of experience and ruthless efficiency, designed to minimize their own casualties while guaranteeing the hill's capture. In the frozen valleys below, hundreds of soldiers waited in perfect silence, eyes on their commanders, ears straining for the whistle that would send them forward into what they expected to be a swift, violent victory. On the hill, a deep, unspoken dread had taken root. The veterans, men who could distinguish between routine harassing fire and the ominous quiet before a storm, felt it in their bones. Captain Morrison felt it most acutely. His patrols had reported the eerie absence of enemy activity directly in front of their wire, a classic sign that enemy troops were already in their assault positions, holding still to avoid detection. The usual random mortar fire had ceased. The night was too quiet, the kind of quiet that absorbs sound and amplifies the imagination. He moved among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement, checking positions, but his mind was on the artillery fire plan. He knew his thin line couldn't withstand a determined, well-executed assault head-on. Their survival depended entirely on the final protective fire, a pre-registered curtain of steel from howitzers miles away, triggered the moment the attack began. His forward observers were his lifeline. As the clock ticked toward 0400, the tension was a physical weight. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the wire felt like a prelude. They were waiting for a hurricane they knew was coming, trusting a plan that would be useless if the first warning came too late. The meticulously crafted Chinese plan and the desperate American hope for early warning were on a collision course, and the catalyst would be neither a whistle nor a radio call, but the unintended consequence of a filthy rifle and a young soldier's fear. The instrument of fate was a standard M1 Garand rifle, and its failure was a mundane one. Korean winters created a unique menace for infantry weapons. Extreme temperature swings from day to night caused condensation inside the receiver. This moisture mixed with the fine, powdery dust of the Korean hills to form an abrasive, cement-like paste. For the young private on watch, this meant his rifle's bolt moved sluggishly, grinding against the grit. His fear was rational. A jam during an assault meant death, but his solution was catastrophic. Alone in the dark, he broke the cardinal rule. He ejected the 8-round en-bloc clip, hearing the satisfying ping, and worked the operating rod to visually inspect the chamber. In the pitch black, seeing nothing, he assumed it was clear. He was wrong. A single .30-06 round remained lodged in the chamber, hidden by the very grime he sought to remove. This phenomenon, a stuck round caused by fouling and corrosion, was a known deadly hazard, warned against in training but forgotten in the field. His decision to clean the rifle's barrel was the final fatal step in a chain of errors. To steady the weapon as he peered down the muzzle, he instinctively placed his finger on the trigger, another fundamental safety violation. As he applied pressure to the operating rod handle with his other hand, the stuck cartridge suddenly broke free and seated fully. The bolt slammed forward. The rifle, now functionally loaded with a round the soldier believed was gone, was in his hands, his finger on the trigger. The sear released. The firing pin struck. The explosion of the primer in the confined trench was deafening. A tongue of flame lit his stunned face for an instant. In the valleys below, Chinese officers, their watches showing 0347, heard the distinctive crack of a garand, a sound not from their own weaponry. Interpreting it as either a compromised signal or the discovery of their advance, the battalion commander made a historic miscalculation. He ordered the attack immediately, sacrificing synchronization for momentum. The private's accident had not just made noise, it had sent a false, irrevocable command to hundreds of waiting enemy soldiers. The hillside erupted in a cacophony of light and sound. Chinese whistles shrieked, not as a coordinated signal, but as a frantic reaction to the unexpected gunfire. Bugles sounded the charge, but the first assault waves surged forward without the devastating mortar barrage that was meant to shatter the American defenses. On the American line, chaos transformed into desperate action. The accidental shot was the only warning they got, but it was enough. Captain Morrison, already on edge, didn't hesitate. "Final protective fire now! All positions, stand to!" he roared into his field phone. The private who fired the shot was now flattened against the parapet, but his mistake had just activated the battalion's entire defensive protocol. Down the line, sergeants kicked sleeping men awake. Machine gunners, who had been dozing beside their weapons, ripped off canvas covers and fed belts of ammunition into the breaches. In the eerie, flickering light of enemy flares, they saw a terrifying but disorganized sight. Hundreds of enemy soldiers charging up the slope, but bunched up and slowed by their own intact wire entanglements. 13 minutes. That was the time bought by the accidental discharge. At the Fire Direction Center miles behind the lines, the call from Porkchop Hill sent artillerymen into a frenzy. Pre-registered coordinates for Defensive Concentration Alpha were already plotted. Within 90 seconds, the first salvos 105mm and 155mm howitzer shells were screaming through the air. They did not land on the advancing first wave, but behind them, in the valleys and approach trenches where the Chinese second and third waves, along with their mortar teams and engineers, were still assembling or moving forward. The effect was catastrophic. The Chinese attack, launched in disarray, was now being cut in half. The lead elements reached the wire without support, where interlocking fields of American machine gun fire cut them down. The supporting elements were caught in the open by high explosives. The meticulously planned, synchronized assault had shattered against the unexpected, unplanned, but brutally effective wall of fire that 13 minutes of preparation had made possible. Dawn broke over the scarred hill on April 17th. The scale of the defensive victory became clear. The slopes were littered with Chinese casualties, many caught in the open by the premature advance. Among the American wounded, a grim task began, policing the battlefield. It was during this grisly work that a medic, turning over the body of a Chinese officer, found a leather map case. Inside were not just tactical maps of Porkchop Hill, but detailed written orders for the 141st Regiment's assault. The document was rushed to Captain Morrison, who immediately recognized its staggering value. It outlined not only the failed attack, but the exact timing, 0400 hours, and the intricate coordination with supporting units. More crucially, it contained references to broader divisional objectives. This was no isolated attack. It was one thrust of a coordinated spring offensive designed to crush the UN outpost line before the armistice talks. Simultaneously, interrogation teams began questioning the 24 dazed Chinese soldiers captured during the night. A political officer, separated from his unit and wounded, confirmed the incredible story under persistent questioning. He revealed, with bitter resignation, that the single American rifle shot had been mistaken for their own signal flare, forcing their commander to launch early and sacrifice the entire plan's timing. The pieces fit together perfectly. The accident had not just saved a company, it had handed UN intelligence a blueprint of enemy intentions. The intelligence coup was immediately radioed up the chain of command. By midday, the captured documents were being analyzed at 8th Army headquarters. The implications were profound. The planned Chinese offensive across the Central Front was now exposed. UN forces at every threatened outpost were placed on the highest alert, with artillery and reserves pre-positioned to meet attacks that were now expected. When the Chinese launched their other assaults hours later, they ran into a prepared and waiting defense all across the line. The element of surprise, critical to their tactical success, was completely lost. The resulting battles were bloodily one-sided, with Chinese forces suffering catastrophic losses from minimal gain. This intelligence windfall fundamentally altered the strategic calculus at Panmunjom. It proved the UN's ability to anticipate and blunt major Chinese initiatives, strengthening the hand of negotiators who could now argue from a position of demonstrated defensive strength. The private's accidental shot had yielded a double victory, a tactical triumph on Porkchop Hill and a strategic advantage at the peace table. The ripple effect of one stuck round and 13 minutes of confusion would echo through the final months of the war.
2 days after the battle, the young private was summoned to Captain Morrison's command bunker. He walked there with the certain dread of a man facing a court-martial. The image of the charging enemy, lit by his own accidental muzzle flash, haunted him. He expected charges for negligent discharge, endangering the position and violating direct orders. Standing at attention before Morrison and a visiting intelligence officer, he confessed to cleaning his weapon on watch. He braced for the reprimand. Instead, the intelligence officer spoke. "Private, do you know what time you fired that shot?" The soldier, confused, stammered, 0347, sir, maybe 0348. The officers exchanged a look. Morrison's stern expression softened minutely. "The Chinese attack was scheduled for 0400. Your shot triggered it 13 minutes early. Their mortar teams weren't ready. Their engineers were still in the trenches." The intelligence officer laid a captured document on the map table. "Your mistake forced them to attack disorganized. It gave us time to get every man to the line and call artillery on their assembly areas. That warning saved this hill." The private stood in stunned silence. The catastrophic error he had replayed in his mind was being reframed as the battle's pivotal moment. Morrison continued, his voice firm. "You broke every rule in the book. You will be formally reprimanded. There will be extra duties. But the men on this hill are alive because that attack came early, and that is a fact." Back with his squad, no one saluted him as a hero. The veterans understood war's strange arithmetic too well. Sergeant Kowalski, his arm bandaged from a grenade fragment, shoved a cup of coffee into his hands. "Dumbest lucky break I've ever seen, kid. Don't ever pull a stunt like that again." It was the closest thing to acceptance he would get. Officially, the record was sanitized. The soldier received a formal reprimand for improper weapons handling, which went into his permanent file. Yet, in the same packet, a citation for a Bronze Star was processed, awarded not for the accidental shot, but for his actions during the hand-to-hand fighting that followed. Fighting he remembered only as a blur of terror and deafening noise. The army, in its bureaucratic logic, perfectly separated the sin from the subsequent service. For the private, there was no clarity, only a permanent, private contradiction. He was the violator whose violation had saved lives. He was the kid who had nearly caused a disaster and now was quietly credited with helping to prevent one. The war offered no clean narratives, only surviving men left to untangle their own guilt and gratitude, bound together by the shared, unspoken understanding that sometimes survival hinged not on heroism, but on a flawed and frightened human being making the wrong move at the exact right time.
The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. Private First Class Robert Henderson rotated home to Nebraska later that fall. There was no parade. He returned to the family farm, the smell of earth and grain replacing the stench of cordite and frozen mud. He married his sweetheart, raised children, and worked the land for decades, a solid and silent man. The Bronze Star Medal was stored in a small box in a dresser drawer, rarely seen. He never spoke of Korea, deflecting questions with a shrug and a change of subject. The nightmares, however, were a private constant. Not of the battle itself, but of that one frozen second, the deafening crack of the rifle, the sudden eruption of light, and the overwhelming certainty that he had doomed everyone. He carried the weight of his mistake, never knowing the full truth of its consequences. To him, it was a shameful secret, a failure of discipline that had miraculously not gotten his friends killed. He lived as many of his generation did, bearing the invisible wounds of a forgotten war, his story buried under the simple, unyielding duty of moving forward. Decades later, in the late 1980s, a military historian researching the final battles of the Korean War tracked him down. Through declassified documents and Chinese after-action reports, the historian had pieced together the story of the premature assault on Porkchop Hill. He read Henderson the translated words of Chinese Colonel Jiang Wei. Quote, "The American rifle discharge at 0347 hours was misinterpreted as our attack signal, forcing a premature assault and resulting in catastrophic loss of coordination." For the first time, an outsider provided the missing piece. The old farmer listened quietly. "I was just cleaning my rifle," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was scared it would jam." The historian replied, "That mistake likely saved your entire company and helped disrupt a major enemy offensive." Henderson simply nodded, the weight of 50 years shifting in a way he could never articulate. He died in 2003, his name absent from most history books. The lesson of his story endures. History is not just shaped by grand decisions and heroics, but by fragile human moments in the dark. In the chaotic algebra of war, a single flawed variable, a scared kid, a dirty rifle, a split-second mistake can somehow add up to salvation, leaving the one who pulled the trigger to forever wonder if he was the cause of the disaster or the author of the narrow, desperate escape.